Well, welcome everybody to the very last stuff you didn't learn in Hebrew school. We figure we go out with a good one. Sounds my phone so people don't bother me when I'm trying to teach. There you go. So yeah, great to see everyone. And this is our last stuff you didn't learn in Hebrew school. And I thought I would cover it. It's really funny. I was actually surprised I had never taught this because I feel like I teach abortion and Judaism all the time. Like I teach the 10th graders every year about abortion in Judaism, like every year I teach them. So I was like, how do I not talk this to like adults? Crazy. But I did kind of like clean up the material, like, kind of like, you know, I made it like a little nicer because y'all are grown-ups. Thought you deserve something nice. So that's what I did for you. Now, I don't think I really give caveats when I teach, but I will say this. I'm not teaching my personal opinions. I'm doing what I think I always really do, which is I teach text. I'm simply relaying to you what our ancient, a little bit of medieval, and we even go to the moderns, text rabbis say. The one time I'm here at night and there's someone else say, this is wild to me. I'll just roll, it's fine, one moment. Never advertised more for a jacket potato than right now. So yeah, I teach text. I'm simply relaying to you the things that our Torah and our Talmud and our medieval scholars and some of our modern scholars, in fact, we're just modern, and in fact, other, texts today teach. I'm not giving you my personal opinions. I'm teaching the text says, and you will draw the conclusions you draw from that. I can almost guarantee you that I'm going to say stuff and you'll be like, yeah, right on, 100%, which she said, I love it. And I'm definitely going to say stuff you'll be like, ooh, I disagree. I don't like that. I don't like what it makes me feel. I don't think that shouldn't be right. God bless a halachic system. It doesn't care about our feelings. It is a legal system. So it's about the law. And I'm here to teach you about our laws. So you'll probably hear stuff you like. You'll probably hear stuff that you don't like. And you can feel however you want about that. I'm simply telling you laws that exist in our tradition. And I'm not telling you my own personal feelings, because I certainly have my own personal feelings on this, as I do with any subject I teach. I'm just teaching you what our tradition says. Unusual for whenever I teach these classes, usually I talk about the Torah subject. If you're new here, we start in our oldest sources, we start in the Torah, kind of trace it through the Mishnah and the Talmud. And we are going to do that. In addition, we're going to touch a little bit on medievals, and we're going to go into not modern Orthodox, and they're modern Orthodox, they're Orthodox rabbis of the past 100 years or so, just because, and current modern Israeli law, because really in Israeli laws, is really the only time you see the practical application of halakha on, well, pretty much anything and anywhere, but in this subject specifically, you never see Jewish law being practiced, and you're not going to see how do we adapt our ancient system to modern day, and because you don't get to see it play out anywhere else except for in Israel, so that's always interesting to look at. So that's what we're going to do, and I got my slides, and yeah, questions before we get started. Add a screen share screen. And hi to everybody who's watching on the recording later. So sad to have missed you. Glad you managed to catch it already. Okay. Got it. So without further ado, Judaism and abortion. Let's start with the Torah, basic fundamental text. Deuteronomy, very famous line, makes it very clear. I call heaven and earth to witness to you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life that you and your offspring would live. It's a very, I think, famous text, and major underpinning of all Jewish law, that we are supposed to value life above everything else. There is almost nothing anyone could ever threaten you with that you should choose death over whatever that thing is. I remember in Hebrew school, someone once, a teacher said, if someone puts a gun to your head and says, eat that pork sandwich or I'll kill you, you have to be like, I'll eat the pork sandwich, because, it's yes, should you keep kosher? Yes. Should you eat pork? Not ideally, no, but it's better to eat pork than die. We believe in choosing life above everything else. If we're given the choice, we should choose life. This is a very fundamental Jewish value. And to deny that that's true would be to deny something very central to Judaism. Choose life. Okay, work. Awesome. There. What else does the Torah say? The Torah says, this is a little earlier in Genesis, whoever sheds the blood of a human being, by human beings shall their blood be shed, for in the divine image did God make humanity. So people, we are made in God's image, not physically, of course, because God doesn't actually have a physical body, but we are the closest kind of God, we are the closest to a godlike creature that ever will be. God created us to be in the divine image. So if you kill another person, you've taken something divine out of the world. From this, we learn that in ancient Jewish law, the punishment for murder is death. In ancient Jewish law, this carries up through the rabbis until a point and they decide they don't like it anymore. But the point is, ancient Jewish law, certainly in the Torah, the punishment for taking another person's life is death. We have capital punishment. Almost nothing qualifies for capital punishment, but murder does. So if you kill somebody in Judaism, we say we're going to kill you dead. Because you take something holy out of the world. Questions, comments, so far? You don't have to like it. I'm simply telling you what the Torah says.
So this text is from early Genesis.
Very.
What's chapter 9? Is that Lech Lecha or is it still Noach?
Lil, come on.
Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. The point is that it's well after Cain and Abel.
Yes.
And God does not kill Cain.
It wasn't the rule of it. Jacob marries two sisters. Not allowed to do that either.
Well,
when we learn from doing that, you shouldn't do it.
Maybe it was the rule, but God didn't tell us.
Yeah.
All right. If the Torah was created before creation. But okay.
Wow. They also say Emukdam Mechar Torah. There's no earlier or late in the Torah. We shouldn't look to the Torah to be in chronological order to glean its lessons. So we could also always.
But okay. Just wanted to point that out.
We're going to still meander around the Torah text a little bit because, again, I like to establish a nice basis. And I told you you're going to hear things you don't like and hear things you don't like, and I'm not here to make you feel good. I'm here to teach. So we know that the punishment for murder is death, execution, and that we are supposed to choose life above all else. This is perhaps in line with what you've already heard or what you already think. We think about like Judaism, we are the bedrock religion of Christianity and Islam, so it makes sense if we know how some of our co-religions feel. With, oh, this is where it comes from. This makes sense. I can see how they got there, and indeed you could. Okay, what point, looking at the Torah, just looking at the Torah, does a person become a person? Well, Genesis chapter 2, we learn God's creating people. God formed not Adam, like the guy, Ha-Adam, like God formed human, like the human, the first person, Ha-Adam. God formed the human, Ha-Adam, from the dust of the earth, blowing into its nostrils. It seems so impersonal. Their nostrils, the breath of life, and then the human became a living being. So what physically is the moment at which this first person becomes a living being?
When they breathe.
When they breathe. Makes sense. I mean, I would interpret that the same way, that when God breathes this breath of life into this Adam, this first person, then it's a living being. So it seems like the Torah is establishing that, okay, breathing, it's a person, it's a living being, which was created in God's image, and the punishment for killing that is death, just as a reminder. Looking purely at Torah law, or don't worry, we'll get into the weeds, don't you worry. Can't see, okay. To use the language of our friends in co-religion sometimes, what about this whole idea of fetal personhood? Is a fetus a person? As a reminder, at the top, I have the text from Genesis. Whoever sheds the blood of a human being, by human beings shall their blood be shed. What is the punishment for murder? Death. Exodus brings us a case study. It's in a long list of other case studies, other examples. And it says, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and miscarriage results, but there is no other damage, the one responsible shall be fined according to the woman's husband. The payment amount to be based on the husband's calculation. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So the Torah is giving us an example. Two men are fighting and they push it. If you've ever been pregnant and you ever gets too close to your belly, you're like, I remember little kids were playing around me and somebody shoved somebody else like into my stomach and I was fine. But like, you're very nervous about anything happening around your belly. So I get it. In this example from Exodus, two men are fighting, one of them pushes a pregnant woman and she miscarries. And the Torah says, but there's no other damage, meaning physically to her. Then the person responsible, what's the punishment for causing this miscarriage? And there's no other physical damage. What is the punishment for these men? Or what is it not?
It's money.
It's money. It is. It's torts law. Any lawyers? And we must have a lawyer somewhere listening to this. It's Jews. The punishment for someone who causes a miscarriage is a fine. It's a fine. You're finding the person who caused this, and the payment, it goes to the woman's husband, because in ancient Jewish law, a woman upon marriage goes from being property of her father to being property of her husband. I tell people, like, your TV doesn't choose to buy you, you choose to buy a TV, and there you go. And so any damage to not just the woman, but damage to children are also considered their parents, their fathers, property until they reach their majority. If they're a boy and they get married, if they're a girl. So if you damage another man's property, you have to pay whatever amount of money, value-wise, or in this case, whatever the father feels is fair. But it's not the death penalty. We already know the death penalty cases. When does the death penalty get invoked? When you murder someone. In the case of causing a miscarriage, according to the Torah, have you murdered anyone? No. You've caused damage, and you have to pay back the person whose property was damaged. Again, check your feelings on that one, but I'm just saying, like, this is what the Torah says. Fascinating, interesting, okay. Questions, comments? People usually have feelings about that one. My 10th graders always have feelings about that one. I can't see the chat, but I'm assuming not. Okay. Let's look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the very first Jewish legal text. The rabbis in the Mishnah look at the Torah and go, this is nice. It's not a legal system. We have to make it a legal system. So we've already established we have the death penalty in Jewish law, ancient Jewish law. At what point the Mishnah wrestles with, is a fetus a living person, a living being, a person, just like any other person? Well, they have an example of a woman's been a bad girl and she is culpable for the death penalty. Bummer. So we have the example, if a pregnant woman is about to be executed, they do not wait until she gives birth. I know, I'm seeing faces. But if she already sat on the birth stool, meaning she is in active labor, they wait for her until she gives birth. So the Mishnah was compiled around the year 200, but certainly existed earlier. It was simply an oral tradition. And then pretty much one guy wrote it down. Other people wrote it down. So again, checking your feelings about the death penalty. because that's not the discussion we're having here. Maybe that'll be next year, death penalty. Actually, which is really interesting in Jewish law, but we're not going to get sidetracked for once. If a woman, and I don't even know how it works in America, I was in American law, if you're pregnant, they'll wait till you give birth. But also the appeals process takes so long, I think that you'll have a 5-year-old by the time you actually go through it. It takes so long. In ancient Jewish law, they didn't have that much time. So in ancient Jewish law, you could have very well a pregnant woman who has done something very, very naughty. Maybe she murdered someone. You only get the death penalty for really bad stuff in ancient Jewish law. So pregnant woman due to be executed. And they don't wait till she gives birth. Which kind of makes sense if you look at the Torah, because going to the Torah, a fetus isn't a person. But they do give us a good example, a good line of logic here. At what point, when do they wait? When do they decide, oh, no, we can't execute her yet? What's the parameter we're giving us here?
When she's in active labor.
When she's in active labor. So that's the point for the early rabbis, and they're going to have much more discussions about this, but that's where we start to see the ancient rabbis go, okay, that's a point where we can't execute her, which must mean that's the point where we have 2 lives here. Mishnah. Again, the Mishnahs are our earliest Jewish legal text. No one come after me and say there was Tosefta, because there is Tosefta and it's earlier, but it's not really as fundamental as a text, so get off me. Mishnah is the earliest one, pretty much. Because the Talmud, the Gemara is based on that. So, what else in the Mishnah? Anything else in our early Jewish legal text? A little bit, and it's a biggie. We have, I'd say, a fairly famous Mishnah in a different section of the Mishnah entirely, Oholot, which gives us another case study. And I'm sorry if you're squeamish. If you're squeamish, don't read this one because you're gonna feel ill. A woman who's having trouble giving birth. They cut up the fetus inside her and take it out limb by limb because her life comes before its life. If most of it had come out already, they do not touch it because we do not push off one life for another. Don't be mad at me. These are ancient rabbis. If you're mad, you're 2,000 years too late. If anyone's ever given birth or watched someone give birth, you know it can be tough. It can be a tough process. So, and many more women died in childbirth then than today. And today there's still too many that die in childbirth. And in ancient times, many, many more women did. And so they have an example, a very commonplace thing that happened even for these ancient male rabbis. They knew this was a problem. They knew this was a concern, a huge concern they had. So they had, okay, the example of a woman who's having trouble giving birth. What do we do to save her life? Because it's choose life. They say, and it's very graphic, and I'm sorry, they cut up the fetus inside of her. Because her life comes before its life. And again, at what point do we say the rabbis? It's not. They don't leave us without a kind of a parameter. They say, at what point do you say, okay, these are 2 separate people, 2 separate individuals? If most of it had been born. 2,000 years ago, our rabbis were already talking about this. And they had the Torah text to rely on to say, oh, okay, we know that if you cause a miscarriage, you're not liable for the death penalty because you didn't kill a person. We know you're supposed to choose life. So to them, it was very clear, her life comes first because she's a living woman. Of course, her life comes first. That only makes sense. And only when you have 2 separate individuals, they go, then we have to say, okay, now you have to make tough decisions, but we can't choose one person's life over another person's life. To them, a woman who's having trouble giving birth, a woman with physical health difficulties, carelessness, it's a no-brainer because it's obvious. You only are dealing with one life here, and it's hers, or you have one life versus another life, and her life comes first. Oh, there's dogs, people waiting. So excited. This is the Mishnah around the year 200-ish. It was redacted. Let's scooch forward a little bit into the Talmud Gemara. So people like to think that the Mishnah and the Talmud are 2 separate time periods. And it's easier to think of them that way, but really they kind of happen concurrently. Think of them as kind of like this, like as the Mishnah, how you can say, as the Mishnah period was ending, the Talmudic period was kind of beginning. So there's a little bit of overlap. So saying this one was the year 200, this one was the year 500 is a little bit misleading, but we'll say for all intents and purposes, Mishnah is around 200, it was redacted, put together, around 500, the Talmud. So we are scooching further into not modern times, still ancient, but less ancient. The Talmud. Okay, so if a fetus isn't a person, what is it? That's a good question. Rabbis in the Talmud look at the Mishnah, where the rabbis in the Mishnah look in the Torah and say, okay, this doesn't give us all the answers. Rabbis in the Talmud look at the Mishnah and say, okay, so we know that if a woman's having trouble giving birth, you have to prioritize her life over the fetus's life, unless it's being born. And in case it's alive, then a person, what do we do? But okay, but what is a fetus? What rights how do we determine who makes determinations? And this comes from this section in the Talmud and Gittin comes from a long, very long, probably at least probably a daf, an entire daf of a man who, well, only a man can own anything in ancient Jewish law, but owns slaves. And it's like if he frees his slaves, but what if he frees one who's pregnant and like who's, because women didn't own, you were housing a baby, you were birthing a baby, but you didn't actually own a man. Some man somewhere owns that, has ownership over those children. So the question was like, if I freed my female slave, do I have to also free her? If she's pregnant, but I can't free a fetus because it's only a fetus, but I can't let her free it because she's only a woman. Like, and there's a whole big long discussion. And it ends with this piece. I only brought you the last piece because it gets very detailed and kind of boring, to be honest. But it ends with this. Rabbi Sarah, the great redactor, we called him, which is not a mean nickname. It's actually a great nickname. He's the one who put the whole thing together. And he ends the whole discussion. He says, he holds, a fetus is considered as its mother's thigh. A fetus is considered a part of the mother's body. And it is as though the master transferred ownership of one of her limbs to her. So again, you might have feelings that, oh, slavery and owning people and how horrible, and yes, like, sure, yes. Just bookmark that for a hot second. Rabbi Sarah, 1,500 or 2,000 years ago, in this time period, made this ruling that ended the whole discussion, saying a fetus is a part of the mother's body. Again, not a separate human being, it's a part of the mother's body, which makes sense because where else are you going to grow? And the one that at the womb. What if we're talking even earlier? More Talmud. This is a much longer and even more boring discussion about sacrifice, not sacrifices, but kind of like temple offerings. Which you're welcome, I saved you from this. But they're saying basically there's this truma, kind of the produce offerings, tithing things for Kohanim, and like, well, you can't have it if you're pregnant. And like, well, but how would a woman know if she was pregnant? Because you don't, especially in the ancient time, there's no EPT test, can't pee on a stick 2,000 years ago. So you'd have to wait until you got big or your period stopped, and even then, my period stopping doesn't even always tell you then as now. So it really depends on you and your body. So they have a whole discussion like, well, but we can't say you can't ever have it if you're a woman, because then most of the time women aren't pregnant. So that wouldn't be fair. But how do we know? How long do we wait? Well, maybe it's okay because, and they come to this pronouncement here, even if a woman's pregnant and she had this truma, until 40 days from conception, a fetus is merely water. Merely water. The zygote. An important little clump of cells, some important water, but it's merely water, not a person. Now it's interesting to note, Rabbi Daniel Rottenberg taught this, and I totally spaced on this, and I literally had a baby, so I'm surprised I totally spaced out on this, but she mentioned something really important. It's 40 days from what point do we count, Jewishly, do we count pregnancy?
Okay.
40 days from what point?
The last menstrual period.
What does the Talmud say? You're right, but what is the Talmud Jewishly? How do we count?
I don't know.
40 days from
Conception.
Well,
then why do they call it a fetus if it's just water to that point?
Because that was the parlance. Everyone, them as us, they're like, oh, we'll call it this, we'll call it this. But they are being more specific. They're saying, well, we say fetus, but what we really mean is it's
water.
Water, merely water. And
So it should say that it becomes a fetus after the 40 days.
You're not wrong. And when I first asked you, said, oh, like your last menstrual period, because you're right, because here's the thing, and I didn't even think about this when I first learned. I learned this Gemara, I don't know, a long time ago, and then Rabbi Ruttenberg taught this, her commentary, a reminder really, is that if you've had a baby, when you go in, they go in and they're like, oh, mom, congratulations, and when was your last menstrual period? Last menstrual period, and they start counting pregnancy gestation from your last menstrual period. So if you have like really short cycles and you test right away, you'll test 3.5 weeks pregnant, almost 4 weeks pregnant. But you weren't pregnant 3.5 weeks ago. You were on your period for 7 days, 10 days, something. So Jewish law counts 40 days from conception.
Okay.
Medical practice counts 40 days from last menstrual period. So for us, we like saying, okay, because you could make the argument, oh, okay, well, 40 days is just water, yada, yada, not a fetus. So if you're talking about like what, like these kind of lines in the sand that people like to draw, for us, 40 days is about 7 or 8 weeks of pregnancy, which is a really important note when you're looking at places and states and countries that make laws saying that you can't do certain things like have abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. But for what we count Jewishly, religiously, we count our time differently. And it's not a comment on what's bad and what's good and what's right and what's wrong. As Jews, we count days differently, which makes sense because our calendar is different and our time of day is different, and this as well. Looking at the medieval.
That's the same thing, yeah.
So the Mission Ohala,
before.
we've looked at before.
Yeah.
And just as a reminder, because I was like, I don't want people after, I'm not going to scooch back. I'm not going to like fast forwarding back, it's too complicated. So I just put at the top really quick as a reminder, if you're having trouble giving birth, you can put the fetus up inside because her life comes before its life. And I really rarely do give extra commentaries, but I mean, I really want to kind of, be more complete in this one because there's so much good commentary. And we learn a really important phrase that's being used in conjunction with the need for an abortion. So this all before this is all talking about, when is a fetus a person? When is a person a baby being born? Yada, yada, all these things. Now we're going to really start talking about abortion. So the Rambam, who was both a doctor and a brilliant rabbi. So he has a Mishnah Torah, which he, with no hubris at all, called the Second Torah. He's like, you don't need to read all that other stuff. You've got me. And it has all these different chapters. This one's literally called Murderers and the Preservation of Life. So he doesn't mince words, God bless him. We're talking about the 12th century, so a good deal after the Talmud. And he's giving commentary that's really on this Mishnah. And he says, on this basis, the basis of what they're teaching in the Mishnah here, our sages ruled that when complications arise and a pregnant woman cannot give birth, it is permitted to, and these are his words, actually this translation is Chabad's translation, so no one come after me, this is Chabad's English translation. It is permitted to abort the fetus in her womb, whether with a knife or with drugs. Also interesting to note that around the 12th century, there was both medical abortion and surgical abortion. Fascinating. For the fetus is considered a rodef, a pursuer, a rodef of its mother. If the head of the fetus emerges, it should not be touched because one life should not be sacrificed for another. And because I believe in giving you the whole thing, even if it makes scriptiatal, although the mother may die, this is the nature of the world. This is the Rambam, this is my man. So he reiterates what's given in the Mishnah. A woman's having trouble, she cannot give birth. It is permitted to abort the fetus in her womb medically or surgically because the fetus is considered a rodef, a pursuer, a rodef of its mother. And he reiterates that if the head of the fetus emerges, which implies they could breathe, which implies goes back to the Torah. So you see the Torah text being touched on here, which is if you really, when the Hadam Rishon, the first human being breathes, that's when that's alive. Same thing. He's like, yes, your head's born, you're not breathing, yada, yada, yada. Because when one life cannot be sacrificed for another, because at no other point that implies, at no other point earlier is that another life. That is not a person, the way the mother is a person. That is not alive the way the mother is alive. And then afterwards, you can't. Because then you have two people. We can't choose one life over another life. And he says, although the mother may die, this is the nature of the world. in the 12th century as now. Unfortunate, he said. This is a way of saying it's unfortunate, but it does happen. A rodef, a pursuer. We're going to get into that, but any comments, questions, thoughts? Well, I roast alive in my office. Being pursued by lack of recognition. Okay. This rodef thing becomes key to understanding. Again, to this point, we've been talking about Judaism and kind of, what's a zygote, what's a person, what's a fetus, at what point is it alive, what point is the mother, and what she's gestating and have equal standing. But now we get the rodef thing. And this rodef idea that the Rambam touches on can be traced back way earlier than 1,000 years. In the Mishnah, around the year 200-ish, Mishnah says, these people may be killed so they do not perform a transgression. What does that mean? So they don't, so like, you can kill someone so they don't commit a sin? That sounds horrible. What do you do? Kill people so they don't commit sins? And then it goes on to a very long list. The first thing which is listed is one who pursues another to kill. Very clever for the rabbis. The rabbis said, we don't commit murder. If you do, what's the punishment for murder? Death. However, there are people who may be killed so they don't end up committing a certain kind of sin, which murder is a sin. So if someone's trying to kill you, you don't just go, well, I'm not allowed to kill people. Like, no, you're Jewish, so you're allowed to. You're supposed to actually kill them first. And the first example they give is one who pursues another to kill them. Ha-rodef. One who pursues, the rodef. The Talmud, the commentary on the Mishnah, in this section, this is literally the Talmud on Sanhedrin 73a, which actually brings in that exact Mishnah, but I spaced them out just so you can see him. Goes into more detail. What does this mean? What? Remember, the rabbis in the Talmud look at the Mishnah and go, hold on a second, how did you get there? The Talmud, Sanhedrin says, the sages taught from where is it derived that with regard to one who pursues another in order to kill them, the pursued party may be saved at the cost of the pursuer's, the rodef's, life? Because then it doesn't seem like, wait, that's weird, like you're gonna let, you're killing one person to save them from killing another person. That seems, how could they allow that? They know that they're gonna allow it, but they want to know what's your proof text. And of course, the proof text has to be Torah, or sometimes from the Tanakh, but better proof is Torah. And they say, you look at the verse in Vayikra, you shall not stand idly by the blood of another. If we know that someone is going to cause harm, to kill someone else, we don't let them do it. Doesn't mean you have to be happy about it. And they actually go on later and say, like, we're not happy about it. But you do what you got to do to save a life, to save someone's life from being actively pursued by another person. It is permitted, and then later they're going to say required, to kill them. If that's true of a person, and two human live people, two living beings, you have to take one of their lives to stop them from killing the other one. All the more so for someone who's not actually a living, breathing human being yet. And it can make you sad, and it can make you unhappy, and it can be gut-wrenching. But at the end of the day, choose life means you're choosing the life of the person who's innocent, who's, in this case, in our discussion, the pregnant person. This is our Jewish self-defense law comes from. Our Jewish preemptive strike law comes from. Don't got to be happy about it. God was not happy about the Egyptians being drowned in the sea, but they were going to take us back to slavery, kill us, essentially. It was a necessary decision. Thoughts? We're getting heavy. Usually talk about demons, angels, and we're going to scooch into modern, because I never, ever, ever bring in anyone modern, but it's just too interesting because we're going to see, and I want to bring you some Orthodox. These are not modern Orthodox by any stretch of the imagination. These are extremely religious Orthodox, but they are Orthodox, and they are modern in the sense that they're 20th century, 21st century. And there's a variety of health concerns and issues that are going to come up that our ancient medieval rabbis never had to deal with because they just didn't live in the same world we live in now. So we've had to, as with all aspects of halakha of Jewish law, we've had to apply our ancient law and our ancient values to modern life. And here's how it shakes out. And it's not, I'd say it's consistent, but you might feel differently. So what about maternal physical health concerns? There are other physical health concerns of the person who's pregnant that didn't exist in those days. For example, in Tzitz Eliezer, which is Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, the 20th century Israel, says if a terminally, and these are all their wording, so don't be mad at me if you don't like it, take it up with these guys, most of them are dead. If a terminally ill pregnant patient who was advised to have an abortion as pregnancy may shorten her life requests that it not be done, so that if she carries a fetus to term, she would then have a child survivor, one is permitted to listen to. Think about chemotherapy. If you have to be treated with chemotherapy or radiation therapy, the same thing. There are a lot of treatments and therapies that are not compatible with pregnancy. And so if someone is terminally ill, meaning they are going to die of whatever it is that they are dealing with health-wise, and they're told you need to have an abortion because pregnancy is going to shorten your life. And they are allowed to say, no, I'd rather have this threaten my life, shorten my life. I'd rather do that and carry this fetus to term. And you're allowed to let her do that. It's her choice. We could say Jewishly, no, but it's her, the mother's life trumps all, and you're allowed to make the, like it's her, don't push one life off for another, but ultimately, what I get out of this is that it's her decision. If she says, I would rather give birth to this child, even if it means that in doing so and being pregnant, I'm shortening my own life, we don't compel her, we don't force her. It's her choice. Emek Halacha, Rabbi Yitzhak Zilberstein. This is, we're going to get into this, I think also a little bit later, if I remember correctly. The selective reduction, if you know anyone's had kind of fertility treatments, you're implanting embryos, fertilized embryos, getting pregnant, like the old-fashioned way, is a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 chance of miscarriage. I think almost every woman I know, like of my friends, has had a miscarriage. It's so common, and that's when things are done the old-fashioned way. When you talk about when we are talking about implanting embryos, the same thing. So if you're going through tens of thousands of dollars of fertility treatments, it is very common to implant multiple embryos, and they don't all take. That's the idea, is that they're not all going to take, but sometimes they do. And sometimes you have someone who's carrying this way, twins, fine, like triplets, quadruplets. It could be far too many, and that could be unhealthy for the mother. It could also be unhealthy for the other fetuses, the babies. They can suffer from not having various reasons. I'm not an OB. The point is, that's an issue that our ancient medieval rabbis never had to deal with because they weren't implanting embryos. So you have Yemek Halacha saying, if multiple fetuses constitute a danger to the mother, we're only talking about maternal health right now, we're going to get into other stuff later, it is certainly permissible to abort some or all of them to save her life. These are, again, as a reminder, these are very orthodox, very religious. These guys don't think I'm a rabbi for sure, even if they were not dead. They would not think I'm a rabbi at all. They're not modern Orthodox. They're simply modern rabbis who are Orthodox, very Haredi. And they're saying this, and multiple fetuses constitute a danger to the mother. Why? Because we've taught from the Rambam, back through the Talmud, back through the Mishnah. It's the mother's life. That is paramount. That's the sure thing. That's the person who's alive. That's maternal physical health concerns. Now, where you start to see a really interesting, I would say, kind of division in applicability of these laws that we've kind of been studying and learning so far is, what about mental health concerns? Because we can easily say, well, I guess if being pregnant or this particular pregnancy, yada yada, is a danger to a person's physical health. Of course, physical health, yes, like it's a road death. The fetus is a road death, and we need to save the life of the person who is carrying the fetus. But what about mental health concerns? And this is where you see a really interesting splitting of opinions, even among some of these guys that we've already seen. And if I haven't said something that's ticked you off yet, I'm sure I'm going to very soon. Maternal mental health concerns. Top left hand, Shlomo Auerbach says, as pregnancy-induced and postpartum depressions are treatable, abortion is not warranted. He simply draws a line in the sand, says, well, PPD and postpartum, pregnancy-induced and postpartum depression is treatable. So for him, he's making that line. It's like, okay, for something that could threaten your life, then yes, abortion is permissible. But for him, he's saying, but depression is treatable. And so we cannot say that abortion is warranted if a woman's emotional, mental health is at risk. Okay. And he's not the only one who thinks that. Underneath him, we have Moshe Feinstein, saying Judaism recognizes psychiatric as well as physical factors in evaluating the potential threat that the fetus poses to the mother. However, the danger posed by the fetus, whether physical or emotional, must be both probable and substantial to justify abortion. And he waffles a little bit wishy-washy in this. So he's saying, he's really good about taking kind of medical considerations into account when making halachic decisions. And he's still kind of more on the Auerbach kind of side of things, which is why I put them on the same side, saying, well, but we really have to, it has to be like a really serious, mental health or psychiatric health concern, just as it would be for a physical concern. Then you've got, good old Waldenberg, love him, on the right side, saying, when the pregnancy is detrimental to the mother's health, although not life-threatening, so it's not, you can see the big split between him and his other Orthodox friends on the other side, he's saying it's not life-threatening, it's not like, oh, this is a threat to her life, but it is detrimental to her health. There is justification for permitting the termination of the pregnancy. Examples, and he gives examples, God bless him, include, because it's just very interesting to see him give these specific examples, borderline physical health of the mother, borderline physical health, so not that it's going not be, the woman who needs chemo to live. They're saying borderline physical health. Very closely spaced pregnancies. Remember, these are Orthodox people, and in their communities, their milieu, that's very common. Very closely spaced pregnancy where the mother is very weak. They saw, I'm sure, a lot of this more than we do in the non-Orthodox communities. Where the pregnancy results in obvious physical suffering and emotional illness to the mother. So you've got the Tzitz Eliezer of the Rodenberg saying that it doesn't have to be life-threatening to the mother, to use his language. It could be where you are just very weak from having closely spaced pregnancies. Or it could be where the pregnancy is just resulting in very obvious emotional illness. And you've got Zilberstein underneath him saying all agree, which clearly isn't really true, but we'll say all agree, sure. All agree that were a pregnancy to cause a woman to become, his words, truly suicidal, I don't know what that means, but truly suicidal, it would be grounds for abortion. So we have a variety of opinions from our Orthodox brethren as to what constitutes a mental health consideration for someone who is pregnant and is weighing their options if they ought not to be. Not a little time. Quick thoughts before we go on to what about the fetus, because we're gonna get into that.
This may be something you're going to discuss later, but again, all I could think about was, and I know we're not going to be political and we're not going to say one side versus another, but all of these are assuming that the law of the land says you cannot have an abortion.
Well, we're going to see this law in practice in a place where that's not true.
Okay. 2
slides.
Okay. All right.
Before we go into that, so there's this all we've talked so far. We talked about like when does a fetus, what is a fetus? Is it a person? What about a zygote? What about is it water? Yada yada yada. Then we talked about maternal health concerns, both mental health concerns and physical health concerns. And we also want to go to what about fetal development? Because I don't know about you, and I know it's not true for any, but I am 98% Ashkenazi. I did the little spin tube thing, 98%, which is just wildly Ashkenazi. And I was honestly surprised. So of course, when I got pregnant and I went to my OB and she knew I was Jewish, I chose her because she wasn't Jewish. I told her that. I was very proud. And she's like, okay, wait, so you're what, Ashkenazi? I did not want to congregate anywhere down there. And she was like, oh yeah, so you're Ashkenazi Jewish. I'm like, oh my God, you've heard? She goes, yeah, I've heard. So I had a test, a genetic screening done, where I thought it'd be like Tay-Sachs. I feel like a lot of us have heard of Tay-Sachs. Like even my dad, I remember him saying like he got tested for Tay-Sachs, before my parents had kids because they wanted to make sure Tay-Sachs was the big one. I get tested for 274 genetic diseases, and I'm only a carrier for 2. My kid's fine. But it just shows like when you are as wonderfully inbred as born Jews tend to be, you got to test for this stuff. And when I meet with couples and I'm doing their wedding, and even if only one of them is a born Jew, I say, you should get it done.
Yeah.
Because you could still be a carrier. They could pass it on, your child could be a carrier. And then they should know, like you should know you go around in the world what you're carrying around with you. So there are a number of, and this is particularly a concern to the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked so much about we know about, okay, the woman's life, if you're pregnant, your life comes before that of the baby, the fetus you're carrying, fine, sure, fine. But what about it?
Mm-hmm.
When do those considerations bear consideration? So looking top left from Rav Moshe Feinstein. He's usually much more, he's pretty hardline about this stuff. He says, as to a number of chromosomal abnormalities such as Tay-Sachs, which can be definitively diagnosed during pregnancy and produce various levels of, his words, physical and or mental retardation, but are not fatal, abortion is prohibited. So he's going back to, and this kind of makes sense if you look at the other things he said. He's saying if it's not going to cause death, if it is not fatal, if it's not terminal, then it cannot abort the fetus, which also implies that if whatever is happening with your fetus, with your baby is fatal, then abortion is permitted. But if it's not fatal, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, then it is prohibited. But there's such a variety underneath him. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. If there is no danger to the mother, but a danger to some of the fetuses, this is when you have often selective reduction, or if you've had IVF, you've had multiple embryos implanted and they all take, kind of thing. If there's no danger to the mother, but danger to some of the fetuses, it is permissible to destroy some of them to save the others. On the right, Eliezer Waldenberg and Tzitz Eliezer says, if there is a substantial risk that the fetus would be born with a deformity that will cause it to suffer, it doesn't say that it's terminal, it says it will cause it to suffer, it is permitted to terminate the pregnancy within the first 3 months. It's interesting he's drawing those lines like, 3 months here, but, and I'm not here to comment on like 3 months or this, but it's just interesting, like they are drawing these lines, delineation, before 3 months. But he goes on. In circumstances where it has been conclusively proven, i.e. by amniocentesis, which carries a risk of miscarriage, probably, that the fetus will be afflicted with Tay-Sachs disease. Again, in these very insular Jewish communities, they're even more inbred than the rest of us. And so there's a lot of genetic diseases and they know Tay-Sachs. They know Tay-Sachs. He says it is permitted to perform an abortion up until the 7th month of pregnancy. This isn't Sarah, the woman rabbi went to school, to conservative school in LA and graduated 5 years ago. This is Eliezer Waldenberg, who is like extremely religious, conservative, little c conservative, like Israel rabbi. And he's saying, if you know it's going to be something like Tay-Sachs, if it's going to be Tay-Sachs, you can have abortion up to 7 months. Religiously permissible. And even if it's just something where if that child was born, it would suffer. You can terminate up to 3 months. Now, you see all these 3 guys are talking about different things. You see Feinstein and Waldenberg would not get along. They wouldn't agree on this, but they're both Orthodox viewpoints. Orthodox Jewish Now, the last thing we're going to do, this always happens to me. Now, we do have, and this has never happened, I think, in any class I've ever taught. So again, I always talk about demons and witchcraft and astrology and all sorts of stuff. But in this particular case, we can actually see how Jewish religious law plays out practically, because we have a Jewish theocracy we can look at. And that's Israel. Now, again, I tell this to my 10th graders all the time when I teach about this and other things, that, it's understandable we live in a Christian-dominated country with very Christian viewpoints on things, because that makes sense because of the history, which is very short, of this country. I get it makes sense. But as I hope I've shown you, Jewish viewpoints on abortion and all the corollary issues is very different. And we have an example of a non-Christian country, in fact, a Jewish country, to see how these things play out. And this part probably shocks the kids the most. So. Modern Israeli law. According to the law that was in Israel, was passed in 1977, abortion is fully legal if the pregnant woman in question is under 18 or over 40, if she is not married, if the fetus has a serious mental or physical defect, if the pregnancy is a result of rape, incest, or adultery, or if carrying the pregnancy to term, quote, is liable to endanger the woman's life or cause her physical or emotional damage. Fairly expansive. Israel. Interestingly enough, for teenagers and soldiers serving in the Israel Defense Forces and the IDF, abortions are fully funded by the national healthcare system. And recently in 2014, in a revision of their national health coverage law, abortions became free to all women between 20 and 33, regardless of the circumstances of any of those above mentioned things, in order to help young women who could not afford to pay even a heavily subsidized fee. So in Israel, the country where there's no such thing as civil marriage, there's no civil marriage. There's no, I can't perform weddings in Israel, I would go to jail. There's only, because like I'm not, Jewish enough. I'm not the right kind of Jewish to be a rabbi in Israel, but because of the kind of the powers that be in Israel dictating these things, those things make sense. But also this makes sense and that makes sense. So looking at what they know, the Torah, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Rambam. And so they look at that and say, yeah, clearly abortion is permissible in all these cases. And this is how a modern Jewish theocracy has put this into effect. But wait, there's more. I really want to give you a full picture. Again, I'm sure you're going to hear me say things and have heard me say things. You're like, yeah, and other things have been like, ew. So let me continue that train. Any healthy married woman between 18 and 40 who wants, and this is not considering the other things, if you're healthy and you are married, you're between 18 and 40, and you want a free or heavily subsidized abortion in a public facility, meaning it's a government run, which is government run, not all, but often, must face a pregnancy termination committee composed of social workers and doctors, not rabbis, giving them justifications for the decision in order to have the abortion approved. So if you are healthy and married in between 18 and 40, and you want to have an abortion, you do have to go in front of a committee and say why. Because on paper, it looks like, well, there's no reason why you wouldn't have the birth. Why wouldn't you have a baby? You're married, you're of a healthy age, you're healthy, fetus is healthy, what's the problem? So there is actually a committee you have to sit in front of and tell them why. In 2016, Israel's Bureau of Statistics examined all the abortions in Israel. And this is what they found. 9% of pregnancies in Israel were legally terminated. 18,032 women applied for approval to abortion committees to end their pregnancies. And of these, 92.3 were approved. In Israel, it's kind of known as being a rubber stamp. If you are between 18 and 40 and you are healthy and your pregnancy is healthy and you are married, and you don't face any of those other qualifications, we saw that long list, you do have to go in front of a committee, and pretty much whatever you tell them, they're going to say okay. They don't probe. Longer term studies have found that the approval rate actually is even higher, more like 96% of applications are approved for abortions. One more slide and then I'll take questions and comments. In 2006, a bill, and it's interesting, this goes both, it's not easy to decide. Look, in 2006, a bill was introduced by Meretz, which is very lefty, MK, which would have eliminated the abortion termination committees because, like other people, Meretz and other folks in Israel said, that's horrible. You don't need a committee. If you need an abortion, don't get an abortion. And that bill was defeated. Overwhelming majority said, no, you got to have a committee. In 2013, Israel's chief rabbis issued a letter in support of an organization called Efrat, which is a big anti-choice organization, saying, and this is what the rabbi said, we want the wider public aware of the extreme seriousness involved in killing fetuses, which is like actual murder. That last phrase, they lost a lot of their bodies for the same reasons that you could imagine, because now you are very familiar with the text. The backlash was very quick and very fierce. Obviously, feminists on the left were like, no. But also other Orthodox rabbis, Benny Lau, this is his statement, his wording. The statement, abortion is murder, is not legitimate. I understand the motivation to fight against extreme liberalism, but a lack of balance is very dangerous to the social structure. A religious society is obligated to take things in a balanced way. The Efrat Association does not have this balance. There is no balance. Taking our Torah in the direction of the Christian Catholic canon law is a terrible mistake. So this is Benny Lau. Not therefore, Benny Lau. You're mad? Write to him. I promise you he doesn't care. So Israel handles abortion in a very interesting way, in a way that I think is very, they try to be as true to the text as we have seen it be. And it is neither wholly lefty or wholly righty, WHOLOY. And you can see the tension between those two sides playing out in abortion law, but pretty much abortion law in Israel just really doesn't change other than making it more subsidized. Questions, comments? Lou, see your hand up.
How strong, how large is the Efrat group?
I've heard of them before that, but I don't think it's huge. From what I am aware of, it's not. Now the question I think is more that if it is a gaining traction. That's a more interesting question that I also don't know the answer to, but that is an interesting question. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know if they were kind of gaining traction as a more reactionary kind of a thing in Israeli society. But like I said, any measures to kind of become more restrictive for abortions in Israel, I think you can kind of see how Israeli society, both religious and non-religious, approach it. They want to leave it alone. They say, what we have works. This is one of the rare things everyone's happy with. Because when you try to do anything to change it, everyone's mad at you. They're like, we have other problems. We actually like this. This is fine. This works for us. Other questions, comments about modern Israeli theocracy in action? No civil marriage, no civil divorce, no non-religious cemeteries. I can't do weddings without getting in jail. They're in jail. But you know, there's another side in terms of application of halachic law being something that allows people more options as opposed to fewer options. And it's very true, because I mean, like you could say, oh, there's no religious law in the Torah either. I mean, religious marriage, religious, like, you know, but this is all very clear. And it's interesting to see how this got applied in Israeli society decades ago and has stuck. I end with the quote that we started with. I call heaven and earth to witness to you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life that you and your offspring would live. We are supposed to choose life. We are supposed to live our lives as completely and as joyfully and as joyously as possible. No one ever makes decisions about abortion lightly. No one makes decisions to terminate a pregnancy and doesn't have some kind of feeling about it. They might be an easy decision with a lot of fallout, and it might be a hard decision, and it might be something that was an easy decision, but they have a lot of feelings on it. Vast majority of people who have to have abortions feel like have abortions because they have to. And neither the ancient rabbis nor modern Israeli legal decisors think that anyone's using abortion as birth control. And so the ancient rabbis' approach to abortion was that this is something that needs to happen sometimes. So how do we look at it? And I hope that this give you a greater appreciation for halacha, because if nothing else, I've always enjoyed showing people what our ancient rabbis and our medieval rabbis, how their minds worked. I think it's really interesting. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'm happy to take questions. We can stop the recording. But I'm happy to